Hey, good morning, friends. It's great for us to be back together, starting off another week. I hope you had a great July 4th weekend with friends, family, neighbors, whatnot. Now we're back into Nehemiah 6. We're in the middle part of the chapter, a small section here, verses 10 through 14. We're going to see yet again another wave of attack. It's going to be quite interesting. After shutting down this smear campaign by the enemies without, now Nehemiah's got to answer and deal with enemies from within. It sounds like the plot for a cinematic film, right? But yet, this is a real life situation in Nehemiah's life. And what's encouraging is how he responds to the situation, the discernment that he exercises, the prayer life that he continues to show us, not just in seeking answers, but in seeking God's face, seeking his will, ultimately for his glory. And so now we turn our attention, as we've just finished looking at uh, this open letter that was brought to Nehemiah with all these fabricated rumors, this fake news to try to get him to cower in fear, as it were, and Nehemiah isn't having it. So now they've got to turn to something else. At least to the enemy's credit, they're pretty consistent. They haven't given up yet. Wave after wave after wave. They've tried the jeering, they've tried the bullying, they've tried the threats, they've even tried playing the friend card, they've tried the smear campaign, and now they're going to try to get people on the inside to turn against Nehemiah. It's sad, but I'm encouraged by how Nehemiah deals with this. So let's look at it together. In verses 10 through 14, it says, "Now when I went into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, son of Mehetabel, who was confined to his home, he said, 'Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They are coming to kill you by night.' But I said, 'Should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in.' And I understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him." And then we see further on in verse 13, "For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way and sin, and so they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, oh my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid." So we see this attack, and then we see Nehemiah's response. Now, let's back up to verses 10 here to begin with. Three waves of attack, assault, antagonism have occurred, however you want to label it. Now a fourth assault occurs. And again, as I said, this time it's in-house. Shemaiah, to give you background into who this guy is a prophet in Jerusalem. He's been commissioned with the task of declaring the will of God for the people. And now, instead of being someone that many would confide in, many would heed his advice in days before. They would be interested in what Shemaiah has to say. But sadly, this man is now being used. He's letting his position work for the enemy to try to bring about Nehemiah's demise. It's a sad situation, isn't it? I mean, here's a guy who gets to speak on behalf of God. And now he's being used by the enemy. It just floors me. I want us to pay careful attention here to what he's saying, to Nehemiah specifically. And I'll explain it in light of the verses that are going to follow here. Notice what he's doing. He's begging, he's pleading with Nehemiah to seek shelter, to seek refuge. He wants him to be in a place where no one is allowed to hurt him. If you notice in that verse 10, he says, "Let us meet together in the house of God, within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they're coming to kill you. They're coming to kill you by night." Basically, he's saying, Nehemiah, I've heard that there's some assassins coming to kill you tonight. Let's go to the temple. Let's lock the doors. Let's hide ourselves. That's kind of what he's getting at here. I mean, if you look at it, he's pleading with him to go to a place that's looked at as shelter, as refuge, a place where no one's allowed to hurt him. The temple would have seemed like a sanctuary, a demilitarized zone, neutral ground, where Nehemiah could not be physically harmed. And Shemaiah's request to him is that they would both go to the temple and close the doors and hide. Like I said, why? Because he's caught wind, to use that term loosely. He's really in on this, that someone is coming by night to assassinate him. And this all sounds legitimate, right? I mean, no one would put it past Tobiah and Sanballat, Geshem, others that would try to murder Nehemiah under cover of darkness. I mean, think about the last request. Hey, why don't you come meet us 27 miles away in this neutral territory, kind of in the middle of nowhere between everybody? That doesn't seem sketchy to me. I don't know what else is. So, wanting to murder Nehemiah under cover of darkness? Sure, that's not hard to believe. Seems like a reasonable threat, right? Which we'll explain why in a moment. However, Shemaiah has played right into the hands of the enemy. He's become their sounding board, their means of manipulation internally to try and get Nehemiah killed. I mean, don't see this as anything else than what it is. He is part of the plot to try to get Nehemiah killed. Again, this is a man that other people would have trusted. They would have taken solace in. They would have listened to his wise words. And now he's attempting to use all of that against the governor of Jerusalem. But notice how it all comes together here in verses 11 and 12. Nehemiah responds, "But I said, should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in. And I understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him." So, in Nehemiah's response, we are going to unravel this plot that has been hatched by these outliers who are salivating over bringing Jerusalem back to its days of ruin. So first, what Nehemiah does is he answers them on a pragmatic level, right? As the leader, the governor of Jerusalem, why would he run away? Shouldn't he be setting the example? I mean, essentially he's saying, okay, Shemaiah, so what if there's a threat on my life? Why would I run away now? The wall's nearly finished. The gates are being secured as we speak, which our next installment is going to show. How will I ever lead these people if I cut bait and run now? I mean, he realizes that he should never put his own safety above the work that God's called him to do. And essentially, that's what he's getting at here. But I want you to notice the clincher in this whole argument. In verse 12, Nehemiah says that he understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. That's interesting. See, he discovers this. I mean, how he discovers this, we don't completely know for sure. Except we do know that Nehemiah is keenly aware that this man who was a trusted prophet, at least before this event, what's coming out of his mouth now is nothing but lies, or hogwash, we could call it. And how do I know? How does Nehemiah know is the better question. But here's our answer. Look at what he says previously in the verses. He says, "And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in." That's an incredibly important statement. It's paramount to our understanding of what's going on. Nehemiah is a man who understands Scripture. Let's get that. Let's apply that, okay? We as believers should be people who know the Word of God. And Nehemiah is no exception to that. But here's why I'm saying that. He knows that the Pentateuch clearly states that only the priest can enter the temple. This is not the same tabernacle-like structure as before. Priests are supposed to be the ones that enter the temple. And beyond that, the priest is only supposed to be entering the temple at certain times. In fact, just so you're not taking my word for it, Numbers chapter 18, verse 7, chapter 1, verse 53, chapter 3, verse 38, chapter 4, verse 15, and then 19 and 20 in chapter 4. Also in Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. All of these passages, which would have been very familiar for Nehemiah, make this clear. And if a non-priest enters the temple, according to these passages, they would enter on pain of death, meaning that they would very likely be killed by God for disobeying his commandment. So here's what Shemaiah is proposing. Why don't you, to just make it as brutally simple as possible, Nehemiah, why don't you go lock yourself in the temple and essentially get yourself killed? How about we avoid this threat of assassination and you just go kill yourself? I mean, that's what Shemaiah is saying, right? Don't you see? Shemaiah knows this. He knows the law. And he's trying to convince Nehemiah to go take advantage of these commandments to his detriment. Go lock yourself up in the temple. Maybe God will kill him. And then the plot thickens there, right? He's essentially trying to convince Nehemiah to commit suicide. Now, the question might get asked, well, what about Shemaiah? Because he says, let us go. Let us shut up the temple. Let us close the doors and hide. Now, if you look back in the earlier part of the passage when it talked about who this guy is, in verse 10, I went into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah. Well, this guy Delaiah, if it's the same person, it references back to Ezra chapter 2, which would have been part of the Levites that were there in Ezra chapter 2. So it's possible that Shemaiah has a connection with the Levitical priesthood. Now, we don't know that for sure, but it's the only possible explanation that would explain why he would suggest that the two of them go and lock themselves in the temple. Likely, if he does have ties to the Levitical priesthood, he would remain alive while Nehemiah would be killed. It's the only explanation I have for that. But the clincher here is Nehemiah understands that God did not send this man. These words that he is sharing with him are not God's words. Nehemiah is able to discern through understanding Scripture that these are not commandments from the Lord. And I can kind of, if Nehemiah was being, kind of snarky, I could imagine him being like, okay, let me get this straight. You're so concerned over my well-being that you think I should avoid the assassins by locking myself up in the temple where surely I would be killed by the Lord. Probably going to have a hard time buying into that idea. And perhaps at this point is when he's starting to assert that Shemaiah is really just a puppet for Tobiah and Sanballat. How much do they pay you, Shemaiah? What do they offer you to turn your back on me and to turn your back on the people of Israel here in Judah so that I could be wiped off the board? And again, what a sad commentary on this prophet's life that he ends up valuing money, working for the enemy, more than speaking the truth and obeying God here. I mean, but for the grace of God, there go I, right? I'm not saying that we're any better than him. It's just sad to hear that that's the decision that he made. In verse 13, we see, for this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way and sin, and so that they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. So now Nehemiah is explaining the reason why Shemaiah throws his lot in with these treacherous men. If he could have convinced Nehemiah to do this, let's say at best that God doesn't kill him, everyone would have known that he broke God's commands about entering the temple. This was a commonplace understanding. People may not have had the law memorized, but they knew the basics. And this would have been one of those basics. You don't go in the temple unless you're a priest. You don't go to offer sacrifice like Nadab and Abihu unless you're doing it the way God intends. You are going to face God's wrath if you break his commands. So let's say at best he isn't killed and he does do what Shemaiah asks. At worst, he's no longer going to be trusted. He's no longer going to be seen as a solid leader because he would have played the part of a coward. Oh, look, there goes our fearless leader. He went and hid himself to make sure that he didn't get killed while we're all standing out here exposed to the elements and the enemy. Rather than stand, he would have been seen as weak. He would have lost the people's trust and loyalty. He would ruin himself at the job that God had given him. And not only would his reputation be in the mud, but this would also defame God's name. And that's what these men wanted, didn't they? Because that's what Nehemiah points out here. Yeah, they wanted to taunt me. It would give me a bad name. But he also realizes that he should be reflecting the Lord also. They wanted to gain leverage that would put God's name and Nehemiah's name down in order to taunt them. But again, look at the wonderful response of Nehemiah in verse 14. He goes to the Lord again in prayer. But before we look at the prayer, I want to answer one specific question that I think might be on the minds of a lot of us. As we've read through that passage, there's a new name that pops up for us, isn't it? Noadiah. Who is Noadiah? Well, I wish I had a more thorough answer for you, but from what little I'm able to find out and that we can know, what we do know is this. She's a false prophetess. Whether she is living in the land of Judah in Jerusalem or she's outside the wall among these other enemies, she has cast her lot in with these guys. She is part of the conspiracy. She's working with Tobiah and Sanballat, either in a more direct way or in an indirect way like Shemaiah was. But she's part of the conspiracy. She literally is working in contrast to what her name means. It's one of the few things we do know about her. Her name actually means one to whom the Lord revealed himself. Yet she's not someone who's trying to reveal God to people. She's someone who also is working for the enemy. But just notice again Nehemiah's response in verse 14 as we wrap this up. We see that Nehemiah rebukes his accusers. He doesn't pay attention to Shemaiah. He says, what you're saying is bogus, man. This isn't right. This isn't according to what God's law says. And then he immediately seeks God's face in prayer. And again, I'm so encouraged yet convicted by the consistency here in Nehemiah's life. I mean, how short do we often fall to be this consistent in our prayer life when we face diverse temptations, as James describes it? And if you remember back in Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 19, he prays for God to remember the good that was being done on behalf of the people. But now he prays again for God to remember. Notice in verse 14 he says, according to these things that they did, remember Tobiah and Sanballat, oh my God. According to these things that they did, and also this prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. So it's implied there that these people that have been mentioned by name are not the only ones who have now joined this internal grumbling, murmuring, complaining, lying on behalf of the enemy to try to disrupt the work from the inside. And so Nehemiah says, God, just as I asked you to remember the good being done for the people here in chapter 5, in chapter 6 now he's saying, Lord, remember what these enemies are doing to your people. Why is he asking God to remember? Well, I think what we can understand from this is that he understands that there is going to come a day where judgment will be meted out, where justice will reign. He wants all the evil that the enemies have done against his kinsmen to be remembered. And Jim Hamilton explains it this way, that there's going to come a point where there's going to be a settling of the accounts. There will be judgment. Justice will be meted out. And yet, in light of all of that, as he asks God to remember these things, he still leaves it in his hands. God, I pray that you'll remember these things and that one day justice will be served. And I put all of that into your hands. There are a lot of opportunities here, as we've read in the last couple chapters, that Nehemiah could have flaked out, freaked out, gone off the rails, got scared, quit, left, just not do what God's called him to do. But he doesn't. And it's not because Nehemiah is anything special, but because he trusted in God's promises. He sought his face in prayer. He did the work God had called him to. He committed himself to those things. So friends, as we start off in this new week in the beginning of July, I would encourage you with those same things. Let's be faithful. Let's be consistent. Let's glorify God in all that we say and do. It's for his glory and ultimately for our good. And so we'll finish chapter 6 together, but we'll do that at the end of the week next time.